Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. Sorry we're starting a little bit late. We had a little technical difficulty, but thanks for hanging in with us. This is John Williams. I'm a partner with PilieroMazza in the Government Contracts Group, and I'm joined today by my associate, Megan Connor. And we're happy to have you all here to talk to you about the women-owned small business and the economically disadvantaged women-owned small business programs. The material we're going to run through today is summarized on this page. This is an overview of where we're planning to go today. We're going to start with the eligibility criteria for the programs, and then we're going to help you understand the application process, and I'll put that in quotes, application process, because it works a little bit differently than some of the other SBA small business programs you might be familiar with. Then we're going to talk with you about how to take full advantage of the programs and give you some tips on maintaining your eligibility and avoiding common pitfalls. We're going to wrap up with some discussion of things that are coming down the pike, and time allowing, we're hoping to have a special message from Ann Sullivan, who's with the Women Impacting Public Policy, or WIP. WIP has been spearheading the Challenge Her initiative that we're going to talk about today. And that organization has also been at the forefront of shaping the direction of these important programs. So we hope everybody can stick around to hear from Ann. And then we'll do our best to leave time at the end for questions. So throughout the course of the presentation, if you would just type in your questions, and I see we already have one typed in, we will answer as many as we can at the end of the presentation. And any we're not able to get to today, we'll follow up with you by email to make sure that everyone's questions are answered. Okay, so let's get started with the eligibility criteria. And a common and critical criterion for both of the programs is that you have to be small, obviously. Small business status is determined by your average annual revenue for the last 3 completed fiscal years, or it's determined by your number of employees averaged over the pay periods in the last 12 months. And whether it's revenue or employees depends on your industry. An important concept that every small business or potential small business needs to be aware of is affiliation, because affiliation will impact your size status. There's a variety of ways that you could become affiliated with another company, and that affiliation might cause you to lose your small business status. The key is when one firm controls or has the power to control another company, or a third party controls both. So as an example, let's say that your business is owned 51% by one individual, and that same individual owns 100% of a second business. Those two companies are going to be affiliated based on the common controlling ownership. So when the SBA looks at the size of the first company, they're going to add the revenue of the second company in determining whether it's small. So you may be small on your own, but if your affiliate is not, or in combination the two companies aren't small, then you may have an issue with your size status. There's a lot that you can go into in talking about affiliation. That's not the focus of this presentation, but we want to just mention that at the outset, that small business is a critical aspect of being eligible for both of these programs. So specifically for the WOSB eligibility criteria, the company needs to be owned 51% by one or more women who are U.S. citizens. And when we say 51%, we don't mean 50.9. It needs to be at least 51% ownership. And that ownership has to be unconditional and direct. So what that means is a woman has to hold the ownership herself. It can't be held through a holding company or another type of trust, although in the case of a revocable trust, that's a permissible way to hold the ownership. but generally the woman herself needs to hold the ownership. It needs to be unconditional. What that means is that you can't have restrictions on what the woman is allowed to do with her ownership. Sometimes you see in operating agreements and bylaws, and particularly ones that you can get off the web or that you can get from LegalZoom, and they're not really geared towards these programs. They'll have sort of standard provisions that say no one's allowed to sell their ownership in the company unless they first offer the ownership back to the other owners, give them a right of first refusal to buy them out. And the SBA has, in looking at the same requirement for other programs, has said that's a condition on ownership, because the woman is not allowed to do anything she wants whenever she wants with her ownership. So you need to be careful when you're governing documents when it comes to those types of potential conditions on ownership. A woman also needs to control the company. And control means a couple things. It means long-term decision-making, and it means day-to-day management and administration of business operations. So it means highest-ranking officer in the company. It means actually in control, not just a figurehead, but actually in control of these functions. And when I turn it over to Megan here on the next slide, she's going to drill down in more detail on some of these requirements. So what I'm giving you here is more of an overview of the WOSB eligibility criteria. And the last point on this slide I want to mention is that not all of the NAICS codes are available for the program. So you need to check the list of available NAICS codes to make sure that your industry code is available. And later in the presentation, we're going to have a link for you. And before I turn it over to Megan, I just want to ask the group, we've got a few comments indicating that there's an echo or a reverberation going on. I wonder if that's been fixed. If somebody could type in a question or a comment, let us know whether that's still happening. Apologize for that. Okay, we're getting thumbs up here. Thank you very much, everybody.
Technology is wonderful, but sometimes it's not. So John was just touching on how control, the woman must control the business in order for it to be a women-owned small business or an economically disadvantaged women-owned small business. And when you talk about control, we also need to consider negative control. And we've included here some provisions, as John alluded to. Sometimes a canned operating agreement or a canned bylaws will not necessarily address some of the things that you need to think about when you're a woman-owned small business or an economically disadvantaged woman-owned small business. And in that way, what I mean is that sometimes the minority members or minority owners will have certain rights that under, general organization law, LLC law might be okay or even preferred. But the SBA wants to see that the woman has essentially unfettered control over the day-to-day operations of the company. So here are the examples that we've included. If the operating agreement requires each member to sign a contract in order to bind the company, then a minority member could very well hold up. I'm back on. I've been told. I apologize for that. We were talking about examples of negative control that might appear in operating agreements or bylaws of a company, or that could affect the woman's control of her company. The second one that I was touching on was a operating agreement or bylaws where it provides that withdrawals and transfers from the company bank account require the signature of each member. Again, the minority member is allowed to have a say in the company, but the minority member can't in any way control the day-to-day, operations of the company. So control also, we look at the position of the woman and the experience of the woman. Position does matter. So the company should be the woman's focus. The woman who holds the highest officer position must manage the day-to-day operations of the company. Now with that said, whatever that highest position is in the company, whether it's a CEO or president, whatever, that woman does not also need to be the owner. a woman must hold the highest officer position, and a woman or women must directly own and control at least 51% of the company. It could be separate women filling ownership and management roles, but one must have the control of the management, or the highest officer position, and one must own. We had a question about this before the webinar, and I just wanted to touch on this, that if the woman is essentially the managing the company, she must have the highest officer position. And as I mentioned, experience also matters. So if she has the highest officer position, she must also have managerial experience of the extent and complexity needed to run the business. She doesn't necessarily need to have the technical expertise or possess the required license to control the company, but she must be able to demonstrate that she has the ultimate managerial and supervisory control over those who have the technical expertise and licenses. But if a man possesses the required license and has an equity interest in the business, in other words, if he's a minority owner, he may be found to control the company and not the woman. So you want to make sure that your resume reflects the industry of your company. We've included here a hypothetical, which you can look back on. We won't spend too much time on this, but I just wanted to kind of give an overarching message as far as the SBA is going to give a closer look to a WOSB or EDWOSB in which a husband is involved, particularly if he has experience in the industry in which the company is working. It does not mean that husbands cannot be involved with their wives' companies, but you just want to make sure you step through these ownership and control issues carefully if your husband is involved.
Thanks, Megan. So we've drilled down on the WOSB criteria. So now let's talk about the EDWOSB criteria. How do you qualify for this second component of the program? By definition, an EDWOSB is a WOSB, so everything that Megan and I just talked about for WOSBs is going to apply the same here in terms of ownership and control. There are some differences, though, one of which is that there are different NAICS codes available for EDWOSBs and WOSBs. So if you found a NAICS code that fits what you do for WOSB, you're going to have to also look at the EDWOSB list to see whether there's any there for you as well. In our experience, it seems like the more popular codes for our clients, people who tend to ask us about these programs, fall within the EDWOSB codes, but you ought to look at both and when you're assessing what are you eligible for. And again, we're going to have a link for that later in the webinar so you can check out all the codes for yourself. So the real key, though, in the additional criteria here, obviously, is to be determined economically disadvantaged. And we've got a quote at the bottom of slide 10 here that tells you generally how the SBA defines economic disadvantage. But let's click to the next slide where we really drill down on the three important factors in determining economic disadvantage. That's personal net worth, adjusted gross income, and the fair market value of all your assets. So the SBA is going to look at these three criteria in assessing whether you're economically disadvantaged. So you're going to have personal net worth below $750,000. You're going to have adjusted gross income that does not exceed $350,000 averaged over the last 3 years before you're certifying for the program. And you're going to need to have the fair market value of all your assets, including your ownership in the WOSB, be less than $6 million. Now, there are some exceptions that we've got on the page here, for what is excluded from the personal net worth. This is similar to the 8A program in terms of how they look at the personal net worth, the exclusions, and what's factored in. Same for the AGI. So if you're familiar with the financial criteria for the 8A program, you're going to be familiar with the ED criteria for the WOSB program. When the SBA assesses economic disadvantage, they're going to pay particular attention to how family relationships impact the woman's access to capital and credit. And they'll do this for the 8A program too, but particularly for this program, they're going to look at the husband, and if he's involved with the business or he has a similar business and the companies work together, they're going to look at the spouse's financial situation together with the woman in determining whether the woman is economically disadvantaged. So you should go into the program anticipating that in some way your husband's, if you're married, your husband's financial situation may be looked at by the SBA, and sort of prepare for that, and how you're going to want to approach that with the SBA. They're also going to look at asset transfers during 2 years leading up to a certification. So, you know, if you try to shift, if you're over the threshold but you try to shift a bunch of your assets to somebody else within your family, they may very well consider those assets to still be held by the woman, except if some of these circumstances apply that we've got here in the final bullet point, that the assets were transferred to an immediate family member for education and medical expenses, essential support, or for other special events, birthdays, graduation, etc. So there are some circumstances when you can transfer assets to a family member, but it's another situation, like if you have a spouse, that you need to step through before you go applying for the program, just to make sure you understand the implications of your own financial situation and whether you're going to meet the criteria. And before we jump on to the certification process, let me just address the technical issues we've had again, because I know I've seen several people commenting that they got disconnected and there was some feedback. Again, I think we've addressed those issues. We will have all of the slides available, and to the extent we can, the audio, although it may be interrupted, is going to go out to everybody who participated. I really apologize for the difficulties that we've had, and I know your time's valuable, so we're going to try to get through all of the material within the allotted time, but we may run over a little bit just because we've had these issues, and we appreciate you hanging in with us.
Okay, John touched on the eligibility factors, so now let's talk about how a business can get involved in the program. It's a certification process, not an application process, which means that the WOSB and EDWOSB programs are unlike the 8A and HubZone programs, in which you do go through a more formal application process. That's not the case with these programs. So there's two ways to certify your status as a WOSB or an EDWOSB, and you'll have to forgive me because sometimes I just will refer to WOSB, so when there's a difference between the two, I'll make it clear. The first option is what we call a modified self-certification, and the reason that it's modified is because you have to make documents essentially proving your eligibility available, and you have to upload them to what's called the WOSB program repository. The second option is you may obtain certification from an SBA-approved third-party certifier. So once you've completed one of these two ways to certify, you must represent your status on SAM.gov. And I just want to make a note that the regulations still refer to CCR and ORCA, but as we all know, those two have been replaced by SAM. So option one, let's get into the details a little bit about the modified self-certification. As I mentioned, you need to upload your eligibility documents to the repository via the SBA's general login system. So if you don't already have a login for that login system, that's going to be your step one. So the documents you'll need to gather to upload to the repository include copies of your birth certificate, all corporate records, a copy of a joint venture agreement if applicable, and then for WOSBs you need the program certification form, and likewise for EDWOSBs you need the EDWOSB program certification form, as well as an SBA personal financial statement for each woman claiming economic disadvantage. So some tips to think about as you're gathering the documents and uploading them. It is a simpler process if you're already in the 8A program. You just need to upload your initial 8A program certification and then the appropriate program certification form. Again, that's the WOSB program certification form or the EDWOSB program certification form. The documents must be uploaded to the repository in PDF or zip format, and SBA generally recommends zip. And you must keep all documents for a period of 6 years from the date of certification, whether that's your initial certification or any subsequent certifications. Option 2 are these third-party certifiers. There are only 4 currently approved SBA certifiers, and we've listed them here along with their websites. And one important note at the very end is that the SBA has approved WBENC, the Women's Business Enterprise National Council, only for the certification of WOSBs, not for the certification of EDWOSBs. The certification process, it does provide some comfort that you know that a third party is literally going through your documents to see whether you should be deemed a women-owned small business or an economically disadvantaged women-owned small business. You submit an application and include many of the documents that you would otherwise upload to the repository, and you wait for approval. There's a range of fees, generally $250 to $1,000. There may be a site visit required, and the process times vary, 30 days to 90 days. But again, you can go through that process having some sense of security. Once you're approved, you upload your third-party certification to the repository along with the appropriate program certification form and your joint venture agreement if applicable. SBA may also ask you to submit additional documents in the event of an eligibility examination or protest, but initially with this third-party certification you essentially only need these 3. The JV agreement, if applicable, the program certification form, and your third-party certification.
Okay, so we've covered the eligibility criteria and what you have to do to get into the program or programs. So let's now talk for the next several slides about what you can do to take full advantage of the program and some potential pitfalls once you're certified. We're seeing several questions pop up, by the way, so keep your questions coming. Because we had the issue with the disconnection earlier, it looks like we're not seeing questions that were submitted during the first 15 minutes or so. So if you had a question early on and you don't mind resubmitting it, then that we can make sure we get to everybody's questions. So contract opportunities in these programs. Right now we have competitive set-aside contracts. There are no sole source, there's no sole source ability yet for these programs, although, and we'll touch on this later, and Ann may have more she can add. We're hoping that that is something that may be coming in the future. The good news, though, is the dollar cap threshold is gone, and I think that's been a big development for the programs this year. It was passed back in January, and I think it was May that it went into the regs. So there used to be, in case you're not familiar, there used to be limitations on the value of contracts that could be run through the set-aside program for EDWOSBs and WOSBs, but they've removed that. We like to say they were training wheels on the program. I mean, it really limited the usefulness of the program for women, as well as the lack of the sole source ability certainly holds it back. It's not on par with the other programs that have sole source and don't have dollar cap limitations on the amount of work. So we're 1 for 2 so far in getting those training wheels off, and hopefully we'll see some movement on the sole source issue in the future too. But part of the reason why I think you're seeing more activity through these programs, of course, is that the agencies are not limited in the value of contracts they can put through, and that should only help to further increase the use of these programs. Something else that has done a lot of good this year in increasing the use of and contracting opportunities for these programs is the Challenge Her campaign that WIP has been at the forefront of, really trying to get agencies and contractors together and overall increasing awareness of these programs, because they're new. Relatively speaking, they're new. They were a long time coming, but they're relatively new compared to the other programs, and so some of the challenge has been just to increase awareness at the agencies that they can do contracts through these programs. We've talked about it several times, but knowing your NAICS codes is critical to maximizing your opportunities in the program, and making sure that your NAICS codes and your capabilities line up with the industries that are available through these 2 programs. So check out the list. We've got it linked here. It's on the web. Make sure that you're on top of what you can go after through these programs. And a note here at the end that you do have the ability through the SBA, so if you can get the SBA to do this, they can appeal the contracting officer's decision not to make a particular contract available through the WOSB program. So, you know, a lot of what we've got to do collectively in this community is better market and push agencies that these types of contracts are available. They're a great way to meet their goals as well as their requirements. But if we run into difficulty with an agency, you can, through the SBA, seek to challenge their decision not to use these programs. Another avenue to take full advantage of this program or these programs is joint ventures. And a lot of you are probably familiar with joint ventures. We do a number of joint ventures for the different set-aside programs. Probably the most popular version is the 8A mentor-protege joint venture, because that one allows you to do a joint venture with a large business mentor. That is unique. There is no similar ability for the WOSB programs yet. But the SBA has been working on a mentor-protege program for all of the different types of small businesses for a while now. The last we heard, it still hasn't left the SBA, which means it's still a little ways away from even being proposed. But when it does get proposed, we've heard they're going to pattern it after the 8A program, which gives us some hope that we might have the ability to do a mentor-protege joint venture with a large business mentor for WOSBs and EDWOSBs. For now, EDWOSBs and WOSBs can joint venture with other small businesses. And that's basically what this slide is telling you, as long as you meet certain criteria in your joint venture agreement. So you've got to have a written joint venture agreement. It's got to touch on a number of factors. We've only summarized them here. These are, again, if you're familiar with joint venturing in general through the small business programs, this is going to look very familiar to you. They're pretty similar requirements. Keeping your documents updated is another critical thing to make sure you stay on top of once you're in the program, so you can take full advantage of it. You're supposed to upload updates and amendments to your eligibility documentation, sort of on a rolling basis. So as these documents change, you want to make sure you get them into the repository so that when it comes time to prove your eligibility, if there's a contract protest or an eligibility exam, you've got the latest and greatest information updated into the system to show that you're eligible. Outdated information, that dings people a lot, that they didn't realize that they didn't have their most recent version of their bylaws, or they never changed something once one of the owners left, or they brought on a new owner and it impacts eligibility. And by the time a protest is filed and you come to us asking for help defending the protest, it's too late for us to go back and change your operating documents, because they're going to look at what those documents said at the time your offer went in. So that's why we say here, before you submit your offer on any of these set-asides, you need to make sure that your repository documents are up to date. And the contracting officer is going to go in and verify that. And not only is the contracting officer going to verify that, but you might get protested. And Megan will talk about protests a little later. What happens after the documents are uploaded? If you're the successful offeror, then you're going to log into the system, the repository, GLS, and select the agency and the contracting officer and authorize them to access your documents so that they can verify that everything that's in there is where it's supposed to be and that you look eligible. And they're going to have that access for a 90-day period. I would be interested in hearing from any of the attendees if you want to submit a comment or a question about how this has worked in practice, because I've never logged into GLS after an award. I don't know how easily the system works, if there's been any pitfalls or issues that you folks have experienced with that so far. It might be helpful for the whole group to know, but at least on paper anyway, this is how the process is supposed to work after you've uploaded documents and you've been awarded a contract. And then obviously the contracting officer, once they've been given the access, is going to go in and make a verification. If they're not able to do that, then they can't go forward with the award. So that's the real key here, that you potentially jeopardize a contract award that the agency wants to make to you if you haven't done a good job of keeping your documents uploaded. So you really have to stay on top of this. You want to, and I'm going to come back to this when we talk about the presumed loss rule later, but you really want to have a designated corporate official whose responsibility it is to oversee and make sure that you're uploading these that things get into the system when they need to. You don't just want to put this on autopilot, because it really can cost you a valuable contract award that you put in a lot of time and resources to winning, but you maybe get tripped up because you hadn't paid attention to your repository documents.
So as part of the CO verification, if the CO has any credible information that essentially the apparently successful offerer may not be a WOSB or an EDWOSB, then the CO may report that to the SBA, and the SBA will engage in an eligibility examination. An eligibility examination is an investigation that verifies whether a concern actually meets the EDWOSB or WOSB eligibility requirements. SBA may perform the eligibility examinations at any time. It's not necessarily tied to a specific EDWOSB or WOSB procurement. This is how eligibility examinations differ from status protests. A status protest is tied to a specific procurement or requirement for EDWOSB or WOSB set-asides. An eligibility examination is not. However, the SBA may consider protest allegations set forth in a status protest when it performs an eligibility examination. Now, it's important to remind everyone, as John was alluding to, that it's a self-certification process or a third-party certification process. We had a question pop up, will the SBA send me a notice after I upload my documents, after I certify? No, the SBA will not. Your documents are there until the CO verifies, and then the SBA essentially gets involved when there's a problem, either this eligibility examination or a protest. So you want to be prepared for either an eligibility examination or a status protest. We suspect that with the lifting of the dollar caps on these set-aside programs, more attention is going to turn to them. So the SBA will notify a firm in writing if its eligibility is being examined or its status protested. The SBA will then request that the concern provide some documents or information relating to its eligibility. The documents they request, we'll get to that, but it could be what's initially in your repository. It could be other things that may be related specifically to a procurement. A firm may request an extension to provide the documents or information requested by the SBA, but the SBA is not required to grant you that extension, and they may in fact draw an adverse inference if the firm fails to cooperate. So the documents that may be requested as part of an eligibility examination and protest. First, for both WOSBs and EDWOSBs, the SBA is going to want to see all the documents submitted to the repository. Then they're going to ask for other things that are maybe tied more to a specific solicitation, like copies of proposals or bids, because remember, in those proposals and bids, you're also representing yourself as an EDWOSB or a WOSB. For EDWOSBs only, in other words, in addition to this first bullet, EDWOSBs will also need to submit signed copies of their SBA Form 413, which is their personal financial statement, their 3 most recent personal income tax returns for the women claiming economic disadvantage, and for their spouses, unless they are legally separated. And lastly, the SBA will ask the EDWOSB to complete a request for tax transcript form. So what happens if the SBA cannot verify eligibility? Obviously, if the SBA can verify eligibility, everything's fine. But if they can't, then there's a problem. The SBA Director of Government Contracting will send the concern a notice explaining the reasons why the SBA believes that the firm does not qualify as an EDWOSB. The firm will then have 15 calendar days from the date of that notice to respond. After that, the Director of Government Contracting will consider the reasons for proposed eligibility and any information the concern submitted, and will send a written decision with the findings. If that decision finds that the EDWOSB or WOSB was not eligible, then the Director of Government Contracting will notify the concern that they must remove their designation as an EDWOSB or WOSB from SAM within 5 calendar days. This decision is effective immediately and remains in full force and effect unless a new eligibility examination verifies that the concern is an eligible EDWOSB or WOSB. In other words, in an eligibility examination, there is no right of appeal. This differs from a status protest. The protest process, and these are similar to a size protest, which I assume most of the attendees are familiar with. But the SBA will determine the EDWOSB or WOSB status of the concern within 15 business days, or they may seek an extension of that time from the CO. In the meantime, the CO may award the contract if the SBA has taken more than 15 business days to render its decision. But the CO must determine in writing that there is an immediate need to award the contract and that waiting until SBA makes its determination will harm public interest. This is a pretty high standard, so as you might expect, COs rarely do so, rarely move forward without an SBA decision. SBA will then notify the contracting officer, the protester, and the protested concern in writing of its determination, and any of those interested parties may appeal the decision to SBA's Office of Hearings and Appeals.
Thanks, Megan. A couple more things to talk about in the avoiding pitfalls section, although I'll run through them relatively quickly so we can get to looking ahead and Ann Sullivan and then your questions in the time we have left. But the presumed loss rule is something that you might have heard of, and I assume, we didn't do a poll, but I assume most of the attendees are participants in some small business program, whether it's the woman-owned program or 8A or just plain old small. And regardless of which group you fall into, you need to be aware of the presumed loss rule. This is sort of my little baby to get this out there, to make sure that the small business community understands these new rules that just went into effect back in August, although they've been a while coming because they implement some provisions in the Small Business Jobs Act that goes back to 2010. And basically, what these rules do is establish a presumption of loss to the government if you misrepresent your size or status, and that presumption of loss is equal to the total amount expended on a contract that is obtained by misrepresentation. So what that means, and I'll try to put it in English, is that if you falsely certify that, or you're found to have falsely certified your woman-owned small business status, and you win a $25 million contract because of that misrepresentation, the government can come back and seek, in addition to other criminal and civil penalties, $25 million in damages against you, because it's the total amount expended on the contract is the presumed loss to the government based on your misrepresentation. So what this has done is really increased the penalties for these types of prosecutions. That they've gone on in the past, but not significantly so, and the thinking has been that there wasn't enough of a carrot there for the prosecutors, but now these can potentially be big dollar prosecutions. So these new rules are designed to prevent and deter fraud and misrepresentation. And there are several key aspects of the rule. Obviously, the presumption of loss we just talked about. The rule specifies when you are deemed to be certifying your size or status. So when you go on to sam.gov and fill out proposals and go for grants, etc., you are deemed to be certifying your size or status. There's a signature requirement now that you need to sign. An authorized official of your company has to have a wet signature on the same page of your proposal that includes your size or status representation. The FAR representations are not currently set up to have a wet signature next to where you're making your representations. So there's going to have to be some changes there. There A wet signature means, sorry, I just saw a question pop up, somebody actually signed it in ink. It's not, you're not using sam.gov, sort of a digital signature. It's that an authorized company official sat there and signed the page right next to where it says, I'm a small business, I'm a woman-owned firm, I'm a hub zone, etc. They want that person to have to stop and think about what they're signing to. And they're going to have to change the FAR before that it can really go into effect, because it's just not set up to work like that right now, but that's coming. There's an annual recertification requirement, so at least once a year you've got to go in SAM and re-verify all of your different certifications. And it applies to subcontractors, so even primes that work with a WOSB subcontractor can potentially be liable for a misrepresentation by the WOSB subcontractor. So there are implications of this new rule for primes, even primes that aren't small businesses. And we've talked about some of the penalties. So if I leave you with anything on the presumed loss rule, I want you to take away that you should have corporate policies and procedures for your size and status representations. That's the second bullet point here, that one of the things the rule says, as a mitigating factor, they will look at whether the company had policies and procedures for how it certifies size and status, and then whether you followed the procedures. But most companies don't have written procedures that say, before I check the box small or check the box WOSB, I'm going to do X and Y, and if I have any questions, I'm going to escalate it to the president, and if the president has any questions, we'll take it outside the company to somebody like Megan to help if there's a close call on something. I mean, you want to have these procedures in place. It's not just giving lip service to the reg, but actually having these procedures and trying to stick with them will help you to catch issues where maybe you shouldn't be certifying to your status. Maybe there's been a change or something's happened that you at least want to pause and make sure you're comfortable with the representation before you make it, because once you make it, then it's made and you're subject to liability for it. Okay, last point I want to mention, changes are coming to the limitations on subcontracting. You're all probably generally familiar with what they are. Also back in January, there were some changes made to how the limitations on subcontracting will be calculated. Right now, we calculate them in terms of the percentage of the labor costs on the contract. That is ultimately going to change to the total amount on the contract. So there's going to be some implications there, possibly some benefits, possibly some difficulties depending on the type of work in your contracts. Right now, the performance of work requirements or the limitations on subcontracting, there's a unique requirement or provision for SDVOSBs and hub zones that they can meet the requirements even through subcontracting to other SDVOSBs or hub zone firms, but that there is not currently that same ability for 8A and for women-owned firms. But the new changes will allow all of the different types of firms to satisfy the limitations on subcontracting, either by doing the work with their own people or subcontracting to other similarly situated companies. So in other words, a WOSB can do part of the work with its own employees and part of the work on a subcontract to another WOSB, and as long as it adds up to the 50% or whatever the requirement is for your contract, you'll be in compliance. There have also been some penalties imposed where there have not been penalties in the past regarding compliance with the limitations on subcontracting, and we're seeing an increased number of audits of companies in terms of whether or not they're doing the 50% or the 15% or whatever it is for your industry. So we just want to make sure everybody who is thinking about playing in this program or is already in one of the other small business programs, you really want to be aware of these changes and how they're going to impact your participation in this program. So finally, before I turn it over to Ann, and again, I appreciate everybody's patience that we're a little behind schedule, looking ahead, and she may very well like to cover some of this information as well, but you may have seen a recent survey that indicated a lot of positive growth for the WOSB programs, thanks in no small part to the efforts of WIP and the SBA and getting the word out and really trying to get agencies to understand they have these tools. And the lifting of the dollar cap threshold, I'm sure, has a lot to do with that as well. But you're seeing very positive trends here, and trends that look like they're continuing into fiscal year 14, which is good. The Challenge Her initiative that we talked about earlier, that is continuing, and again, I think Ann will probably mention that. The Mentor Protege program, we hope, is coming soon. We might see the proposed rules in 2014. I think we're probably still more than a year away from seeing the programs actually up and running, but it's coming soon, and hopefully we won't be giving this webinar again next year saying the same thing, but there's the prospect of some more positive developments for the program once we have that Mentor Protege program in place. And there may be sole source authority in the works. We put a question mark there. We don't know how that'll unfold, but we know that advocates are pushing for that. It's another thing we've got to do to get this program on a par with the other set-aside programs. So hopefully we'll see that coming soon as well. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Ann now. Just give us a moment here and we'll.
Good afternoon. Can I know from someone whether or not I'm on? Okay, well, I'm going to go ahead and pretend that I know. I can't see the screenshot, so we're just going to go ahead and hope that everybody can hear me. I'm Ann Sullivan, Chief Advocate for Women Impacting Public Policy, President of Madison Services Group. The number of questions were raised during the webinar by John, and I thought I would take a minute to tell you about the advocacy and the role it's played and the role it will play going forward with respect to the WOSB program. Challenge Her was mentioned. So it took us 11 years to get this law in place, but then the second challenge is, oh wait, now that we have it in place, we need to make it work. So Challenge Her is the brainchild of WIP and SBA to go throughout the country and also have events here in Washington with agencies to try to promote the program, to try to promote awareness for the program, and generally trying to make sure that women who would be able to contract do so, start getting registered in the program. Our other focus is making sure that the contracting officers and those in buying facilities wherever we are in the country are also educated and think about using this program as a way to not only reach the 5% goal for women-owned companies, but to exceed it. The dollar cap was removed. The dollar caps were removed, and I believe John said it was training wheels for the program. But, that didn't happen without an awful lot of advocacy on WIP's behalf. I mean, it required corralling a lot of women-owned companies to weigh in. It required doing inside Senate and House negotiations, it was a huge strategy, required an awful lot of effort, and in the end we won. So just to dissuade anybody on the call from the notion that somehow it magically disappeared, let me assure you that without the help and support of women-owned companies all over the country, this surely would not have happened. Let me talk a little bit then about sole source authority. That's kind of in the same category. With respect to what we see as an impediment to the success of the program. Our feeling is that it removes an important barrier to kind of entering the government market, contracting market, and we think since everybody else has had some success with that, we think the women-owned program would benefit greatly from that. There is a bill that's been introduced on the House side, H.R. 2452, by Representative Nydia Velazquez, giving that sole source authority to the program. It makes some other changes as well, including it would change the way certification is done. But the Senate has not yet moved, but is about to. We've been in discussions with Senator Landrieu, who's the chair of the Senate Small Business Committee. She is on board, and we expect introduction of that legislation fairly shortly. That's important to us because it's important to have legislation on both sides of the Hill being introduced. It shows that there is support, a broader support. And when the Senate bill is introduced, then we'll be reaching out to everybody once again to ask all the women-owned companies in this country to engage and help us fight for sole source authority. With respect to the mentor-protege that John said SBA still hasn't completed their work on, that was another thing that we worked really hard on with respect to advocacy, to try to make sure that that, along with a lot of other contracting reforms that were enacted last year, are put into place. And the whole reason we do that is to try to make sure that small companies have as best a shot as they can have at being successful government contractors. Women-owned companies should definitely consider thinking about enrolling and engaging in the WOSB program. I'm pleased to see the numbers show that there has been an uptick in procurements that are coming out of the program. But to be very honest, the government moves, as you know, at snail's pace. So while this is certainly not the numbers that we wish we'd be seeing, it takes a while for an apparatus like the federal government to actually move toward adoption of a new program, especially a procurement program. So we're not particularly discouraged by the fact that there's not been an enormous groundswell. We think this is much more a case of women-owned companies being educated to go and ask for participation in the program, and we think it's also, it took us 11 years to get it into place, so we're going to be patient. We're going to work with every agency we can think of. We're going to try to educate the women-owned businesses in every corner of the country that we can, and then we all need to join together to be strong advocates for the success of the program. Back to you, John.
Thank you, Ann, very much for making yourself available. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. We're going to take a few questions. I know we're in overtime here, but if you can hang on, we're going to answer a few of your questions, and then I promise Megan and I will follow up with each of you that have submitted a question since we restarted. If you submitted a question before we had a little snafu, we don't see it, so please submit it again, and I promise we'll get back to you all within a couple days. So here's a question we have: can a requirement that was previously an 8A requirement be placed under the WOSB or EDWOSB program when the requirement is recompeted? The answer is yes, although the caveat being that there are special rules about taking a contract out of the 8A program. So whether or not it's possible or feasible for your particular contract, we'd have to drill down a little bit. But in theory, yes, a contract could go outside of the 8A program to the WOSB or EDWOSB program. We also have a question about I think maybe a point of clarification about the lifting of the dollar cap threshold. The question was whether or not this relates to the NAICS size standard, and if so, is this for WOSB or just EDWOSB? The dollar cap threshold does not, when we're talking about that, we're not talking about NAICS code size standards. The size standards are separate and are not impacted by the lifting of the dollar cap threshold. What that means is that previously there was a limit, a dollar limit on the value of contracts that an agency could set aside for this program. They weren't allowed to do a contract valued at greater than $6.5 million, for example. Now, and there's no similar requirement for the other programs. You can do, small business set aside for higher than that, for example. But they've lifted this dollar cap threshold, which means the value of the set aside contracts is no longer restricted.
We had some questions about how long a WOSB or EDWOSB is eligible for the program, and the company is eligible for as long as they remain eligible. In other words, unless there's an eligibility examination finding that the company is not eligible, or a protest in which you need to then recertify or request a re-examination. Otherwise, the company, if it self-certifies or a third-party certifier, is eligible as long as it maintains its eligibility. We had a question about if you have been certified through a third-party certifier, do you still need to upload repository documents? The answer is yes. You do not need to upload the same repository documents. It's essentially only 2 documents that would need to be uploaded if you go through a third-party certifier, assuming that you are not a joint venture. The first is you need to upload the third-party certification, and second, you need to upload your program certification, whether that's the WOSB program certification or the EDWOSB certification.
I see another question here about whether or not you have to update your personal net worth statement every year if nothing else has changed. And I'm not aware of any requirement that you would have to be uploading a new version of that if you're listing the exact same information every year. What you want to be watching out for is when your documents that are uploaded have changed in some respect and they're now outdated, then you need to make sure you're getting the latest and greatest up there. But as far as I know, they're not expecting you to upload new documents just to reflect the fact that a new date, but all of the information is the same. Looks like we had another, sorry, I'm trying to scroll down here. We have a question about whether the husband's salary would be added to the wife's salary regarding the $350,000 compensation limitation. All of the financial criteria have the potential for the husband to impact the calculations adversely. What I mean by that is that the SBA is going to look at the husband's financial situation if the husband, particularly if the husband is involved with the business or has another company that works closely with the wife's business. They're going to look at the financial information from the husband, and while they may not necessarily look at it from the standpoint of adding his compensation onto hers compensation, they're going to look at least the totality of the circumstances, the overall compensation between the husband and wife and assets, net worth, etc., in determining the woman's access to capital and credit. So you can't ignore it, but it's not, you'd have to drill down on, depending on how involved the husband is and to what extent it's going to have an impact. Okay, let's just scroll, see if we maybe have one more that we can answer quickly here. We have a question about if I'm located in a hub zone and which certification would be most beneficial, hub zone, EDWOSB, or 8A, and how long does the process take? We'll follow up with you offline to give you a little more detail, but generally speaking, you're going to want to assess your potential market. what contracting opportunities and agencies are you looking at? Where are their opportunities going? Is it more 8A? Is it more HubZone? Where are your competitors, and where may you have more of an advantage? If you can steer the agency to do the work WOSB and there's less WOSB competitors, that you may see an advantage there. If you're able to qualify for HubZone, EDWOSB, and 8A, you'd be the proverbial triple threat, and really a quadruple threat when you add in small business. So you may find some benefit to having all of those certifications as they serve different goals. But we can follow up with you directly on on your questions about how long those different processes take.
And we just wanted to let everybody know that we will email the slides and a recording of this webinar tomorrow to all attendees. And as John mentioned, the audio recording might be a little disjointed because of issues on our end. Again, we apologize, but we will be emailing that out to everybody tomorrow.
Yeah, don't hesitate to contact Megan or me after we're done. We've got our contact information here. We're going to answer the rest of your questions we didn't get to, and we're happy to take calls or emails on other questions that might not occur to you until you look at the rest of the slides or have a chance to think about it. So thanks everybody for participating. We appreciate your time, and good day.